Hi everyone, I'm Vishal. I'm a graduate student in the Celestial and Spaceflight Mechanics Laboratory led by Dr. Daniel Shears. In this lab, we do a lot of work surrounding small bodies and space situational awareness. My work concerns the development of drag coefficient models that can be incorporated into the estimation framework for orbit prediction. So in the previous presentations, we have looked at the problem surrounding atmospheric density prediction and how it's very dynamic. The other side of the problem is the interaction of the atmosphere with the satellite, which is also dynamic. And this interaction parameter represented by the drag coefficient depends on various factors, such as atmospheric parameters like molecular composition and temperature of the atmosphere, and the satellite specific factors like temperature of the wall, mass of the satellite surface, and the satellite orientation. Now, in order to demonstrate the variation of drag coefficient with the satellite orientation, let's look at an animation. So this animation basically shows the rotation of a cubical satellite and how it affects the drag coefficient. The right-hand side plot shows the variation of the drag coefficient over a surface. So basically, the drag coefficient is not constant. And this can be modeled using gas surface interaction models, which are basically analytical physics-based models. But we know that they are not used in operations. Why? This is because the inputs and parameters that are used in these models are not constant and they vary over time. And these cannot be estimated in the real tracking process because of observability issues. So what we basically do is assume it to be a constant and decouple it with the cross-sectional area, which is actually a part of the drag coefficient. So our proposal is to use dynamic models for the drag coefficient using Fourier series expansions. Now, this approach has been used for solar radiation pressure coefficient and thermal radiation pressure coefficient and worked pretty well. So the main principle is that the Fourier coefficients are orthogonal to each other and can be estimated in the tracking process in situ. So we take two approaches to this problem. First is we do a Fourier series expansion in the body frame, and this helps the model to respond to changes in the satellite orientation. The second approach is to do an expansion around the true anomaly of the satellite, which is basically a periodic model in the orbit frame of the satellite. So this responds to changes in the atmospheric parameters. Now we developed this theory, validated these models using simulations, and I show a case for the processing of real data from a NASA satellite at 400 kilometers. So in this case, you can see how the constant model, which is called the cannonball drag model, leads to an error of around 9 kilometers at the end of a prediction of 9 days. And our Fourier series models are able to reduce the error compared to the constant model. So by the end of 9 days, the body fixed model is able to reduce the errors by 33%. And if you look at the end of 2-3 days, the errors are actually reduced by 50%. So these models can be used in the orbit determination process, and they are not computationally intensive at all. So the Fourier coefficients are basically, for the body fixed models, it's around 5 coefficients that we had to estimate, along with the position and velocity. Now, okay, one slide is missing. Anyway, the application of these models is not limited to applications in the low Earth orbit. So we haven't made any inherent assumptions about the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere. So they can be applied to atmospheres around other celestial bodies, like missions to Venus, Mars, or Titan. And the other important part is okay, that's a really bad slide. Anyway, so the other important part of of the applications is to the atmospheric physics community, where the space weather picture comes into being. So atmospheric density has been calibrated using satellite drag since along because of the global coverage that the satellites provide. But this process of inversion of atmospheric density from satellite drag is directly affected by drag coefficient errors. So any errors in the drag coefficient directly translates to biases in the density models, which potentially affects all the other applications, again, for orbit prediction. So any improvements in the drag coefficient models will directly lead to improvements in the atmospheric density calibration as well as orbit prediction, which basically forms a cycle and are correlated to each other. So that's where I stop. Thank you. We can talk in the break.